Welcome to Holloway Archives. Tonight, we descend into the forgotten corners of American history, where the boundaries between birth and death, between blessing and curse, dissolve like morning mist over a forgotten ridge. This is the story of Dogwood Parish, a place that existed once in the hills of Georgia, where three sisters practiced an ancient craft that predated medicine, predated prayer, and perhaps predated mercy itself. In the winter of 1843, when snow lay thick across the ridge country of northern Georgia, the first invitation arrived at the door of the Carowway house. It was written on bark paper in a hand that trembled with more than cold, requesting the services of the three sisters who lived in the crooked house that leaned into the hillside like a woman heavy with child. The message was unsigned, as was the custom in those days when speaking certain names aloud was considered an invitation to forces better left undisturbed. Hester Carowway was the eldest, though no one in Dogwood Parish could say with certainty how old she was. Her hair had gone white before most could remember it being any other color, and her fingers moved with the practiced precision of someone who had delivered more souls into the world than the local preacher had ever blessed. Eunice, the middle sister, possessed a voice that could gentle the most difficult labor, humming melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. And Maribeth, the youngest, walked always a step behind the others, her eyes holding a knowledge that made even the boldest men look away. They were midwives, the townspeople said, the best in 3 counties. They were witches, whispered others, practicing arts that had crossed the ocean in the holds of ships alongside more conventional cargo. But in truth, they were something older than either term could contain. Keepers of traditions that stretched back to times when the line between life and death was drawn in blood and moonlight rather than ink and doctrine. The invitation that winter night came from a farmhouse on the outskirts of the parish, where a young woman named Catherine Eldridge had been in labor for 2 days without progress. Her husband, a God-fearing man who normally would have turned to prayer and the local physician, had grown desperate enough to seek help from the ridge. The message was left at the foot of the Carowway gate, weighted down with a silver coin that bore the tarnish of desperation, but no one admitted to sending it. When questioned, Thomas Eldridge swore he had never written such a note, had never ventured near the ridge, had never so much as spoken the Carowway name aloud in his Christian household. Yet the midwife pressed on anyway, walking the ridge path as though drawn by something older than invitation. 2 days passed. On the 3rd morning, the preacher's hound was found at the chapel steps, foaming at the mouth and limping on 3 legs, its fur mottled with red welts shaped unmistakably like fingerprints. The copper basin that the sisters used for their work was discovered in the creek bed, warped and darkened as if it had been burned from within by some internal fire that left no ash, no char, only a metal memory of heat. The midwife herself never returned to her sisters on the ridge, but neighbors claimed they heard singing from the Carowway house that night. 3 voices joined by a 4th that was thinner, higher, and not quite human in its timbre. It was a lullaby, they said, but sung backwards, as if coaxing something back into the womb rather than welcoming it into the world. It was Midwife Carowway who began appearing in town after that, always alone, always the youngest, always walking a step behind some invisible companion. She came into town under cover of fog one morning, her apron stained with something that seemed to shift between rust and wine, depending on how the light caught it. Her eyes, once bright with that unsettling knowledge, now appeared unfocused and bare of lashes, as if something had taken even those small protections from her. She stopped outside the post office and stared at the flagpole until the sun fully rose, her head tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening to something no one else could hear. When the shopkeeper tried to greet her, to ask after her health and the whereabouts of her sisters, she murmured only a single word: "Measure." Then she turned and left, her bare feet making no sound on the frozen ground. No one followed her. Something in the way she moved, the deliberate placement of each step, suggested that following would be unwise. That same day, 3 men working to repair the foundation of the schoolhouse discovered a row of carved symbols beneath the floorboards, each one identical to the last. They were concentric circles surrounding a crude eye, burned into the wood with such precision that the grains seemed to flow around them like water around a stone. The teacher, a stern woman named Miss Harwick, who had educated 2 generations of parish children, insisted she had never seen them before. She left the following week without collecting her pay, claiming urgent family business in Savannah. Her replacement lasted less than a month. The new teacher, a young man fresh from the seminary, claimed that the blackboard chalk wrote names of its own accord during the night hours, names of children not yet born, he said, or perhaps never born at all. He would arrive each morning to find the board covered in a spidery script that hurt the eyes to read. Names that seemed to writhe on the slate like living things. When he tried to erase them, the cloth came away bloody, and the names reappeared within hours, darker than before. Mebeth was seen watching from the edge of the trees during these discoveries, her head still tilted at that unnatural angle, her mouth moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely. The children began to fear the schoolhouse, crossing themselves when they passed its windows, and more than one mother kept her young ones home rather than risk whatever had taken root in that place of learning. Eunice Carowway was next to emerge from the ridge, walking barefoot into the blacksmith's yard one fog-heavy morning, long before the first bell called men to their labor. Her hands were wrapped in what appeared to be gauze, but her sleeves were clean, and her voice still carried that strange steadiness that had once comforted laboring mothers. She asked for nails, she told the blacksmith, but not horseshoe nails or coffin tacks. She needed a very specific number, 41. When asked why, she replied in that same steady voice, 1 for every breath he wasn't supposed to take. The blacksmith, a practical man who had never given much credence to the stories about the ridge, gave her the nails freely, but he didn't sleep that night. And his wife later confessed to the neighbors that he woke every hour screaming, clawing at his chest, and insisting that something was hammering inside his ribs, trying to build something in the cavity where his heart should be. He died 3 days later, with no wound visible on his body and no known cause that the physician could determine. His heart, when examined, appeared to have simply stopped, as if someone had reached inside his chest and stilled it with a gentle touch. The nails Eunice had requested were found beneath his pillow after his death, arranged in the perfect shape of a cradle, each one driven through the fabric and into the mattress below with a precision that spoke of practiced hands. The local physician called it grief, claiming the man had never recovered from the loss of his own infant son years before. The reverend called it judgment, suggesting that the blacksmith had committed some sin that required divine retribution. But those who remembered the way Eunice had held her silence, the way she had spoken of Brett's not taken, knew better. She had not come seeking help. She had come to return what was owed, to balance some ledger that existed beyond the understanding of mortal accounting. A child was born on the edge of Wethersfield the following week, though no one claimed to have witnessed the labor itself. The mother, a quiet girl named Maynard Pearl, had vanished from the town rolls months prior, said to have wandered into the woods near Carowway Ridge after her father's funeral left her with no family and no prospects. She returned that winter morning, barefoot and dazed, carrying a swaddled infant with skin too pale to be healthy, and hair so fine it seemed to disappear in even the slightest breeze. When asked about the birth, Maynard claimed she didn't remember the labor itself, only the sound of breathing that wasn't hers echoing through the trees as she delivered the child alone. When pressed for the infant's name, she answered with the certainty that chilled those who heard it. He already has one. They gave it to him before he drew his first breath. The infant would not cry, no matter what stimulus was applied, nor would it nurse from its mother or from any wet nurse brave enough to attempt the feeding. It only watched, its eyes tracking movement with an intelligence that seemed too old for its tiny body. Within a week, the Pearl household had gone quiet, the curtains drawn tight against both daylight and prying eyes, the chimney cold despite the bitter winter air. A neighbor girl, curious and perhaps too bold for her own good, peered through the kitchen window one evening and swore the baby was no longer in its cradle. Instead, it sat upright at the family table, still swaddled, but somehow supporting itself, staring at the family as they bent their heads in prayer. The girl's mother forbade her from speaking of what she had seen, but the damage was done. No one entered the Pearl house after that, and by month's end it stood empty, the door ajar and the wind moving freely through rooms that still smelled faintly of milk and something else, something sweeter and more disturbing. When Hester Carowway returned to the world of the living, it was not by foot, but by fire. Witnesses from the far side of the parish claimed to see a strange glow at the crown of the ridge just after midnight, a steady orange light too bright for any lantern or hearth fire they had ever seen. Yet no smoke followed the light, no ash drifted on the wind. There was only the sound of iron rasping against iron, rhythmic and deliberate, like the drawing of shears across bone, or the filing of metal that had grown too dull for its intended purpose. At sunrise, Hester stood in the center of the town square, barefoot like her sisters, her skirt hem soaked and stiff with something that might have been dew if dew ran red and thick. She held a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be funeral linens, the kind used to shroud the dead before burial. She set it at the base of the well that had served the town for 3 generations and spoke only once, her voice cracking like old parchment left too long in the sun. "It belongs to the earth now," she said, and then she turned and walked back toward the ridge without another word, her bare feet leaving prints in the frost that steamed in the morning air. No one dared unwrap the bundle she had left behind, but flies came fast and thick, drawn by something that spoke to their most primitive instincts. The bundle was gone by dusk, though no one claimed to have moved it. In its place was a perfect circle of soil, bare and hairless, where no grass would grow thereafter. A child who stepped into that circle days later emerged with his teeth clamped shut and would not open them again, not to eat, not to speak, not even to scream. He starved within a week, his jaw locked in a rictus that suggested he was holding something inside his mouth, something that must not be allowed to escape. That winter, silence spread faster than snow across Dogwood Parish. Mails stopped arriving, roads disappeared beneath drifts that no one remembered seeing fall. The chapel bell, long since silenced by a rope that had frayed beyond repair, began to toll once more, though no one claimed to have mended it. Each night, at the stroke of 3, a single note rang out across the parish, low and hollow, like the breath of something dying by degrees. Livestock began birthing malformed litters, creatures that bore only a passing resemblance to their parents. Milk turned sour in the pail before it could be carried to the house, and eggs cracked in the nest, releasing not chicks, but something else. Something that skidded away into the darkness before anyone could get a clear look at it. Yet the Carowway sisters were seen more frequently than ever, walking single file through the woods with jars of what appeared to be bone-colored wax and cloth bundles stitched with symbols that no living person could decipher. A traveling reverend who attempted to intervene to offer salvation to what he perceived as lost souls vanished on the ridge one November evening. He left behind only his boots, placed neatly side by side on the chapel steps, and a torn page from his journal. Scrawled across it in cramped script were 5 words that would haunt the few remaining residents. They are not just midwives. The page was later found sealed behind the chapel's cross, smeared with the ring of what appeared to be umbilical blood, though no birth had been recorded in the parish for months. The cross itself had begun to lean, not from wind or weather, but as if something on the other side was pushing against it, trying to tip the balance between sacred and profane. By winter's deepest grip, the township had begun to empty, not in sudden flight, but in slow erosion. Families quietly packed wagons at dusk, lifting children from their beds before sunrise, leaving curtains swaying in open windows like flags of surrender. No farewells were exchanged, no markers left behind to explain their departure. There was only absence, spreading like a stain through the community that had once thrived in the shadow of the ridge. The Carowway house disappeared that night, not with thunder, not with flame, not with any of the dramatic flourishes that mortal minds might expect from such a momentous event. One moment, it stood crooked and watchful, its windows reflecting starlight that seemed to come from constellations that belonged to no earthly sky. The next moment, there was nothing but a depression in the earth, a basin-shaped hollow, wide and deep, lined with what appeared to be human hair, woven together with such precision that it resembled fabric more than any natural growth. The snow did not fall into this depression. The air above it did not stir. Only a faint scent lingered there, sweet like milk and sharp like pine, And beneath those familiar odors, something older and saltier, like blood that had been washed too many times in the same cloth until it had given up all pretense of being anything other than a stain that could never be fully removed. By morning, the last remaining townspeople had gathered without speaking, drawn by some instinct that operated below the level of conscious thought. They stood in silence at the edge of the depression, their hands folded over their chests in postures that suggested both prayer and protection, though none could have said which deity they were addressing or what threat they were attempting to ward off. Some wept, tears falling silently onto cheeks that had grown pale from months of insufficient sunlight and inadequate nutrition. Some smiled with expressions that suggested they were finally understanding jokes that had been told to them years earlier. But none moved to leave, and one by one, they began to hum. Not any particular song or psalm, but simply the sounds of the womb remembered, the vibration of being held before the world had asked them to breathe, before time had given them names, before the first stitch had been sewn or the first sound had been made. When the snow finally melted, which it did all at once on a day when no weather patterns could have predicted such a sudden thaw, Dogwood Parish was no longer marked on any map. No roads led to it, no postal routes included it in their circuits, no official correspondence arrived to disturb whatever peace had finally settled over the ridge and the valley below it. But somewhere, when the night is quiet enough, and the air is still, and the moon is hidden behind clouds that seem too thick to be entirely natural, mothers still wake suddenly in distant places, clutching their bellies without understanding why, feeling movement that has no source, and hearing lullabies that have no singer. And in the distance, if they listened carefully enough, something rocks with the patient rhythm of hands that have learned to comfort what cannot be born and cannot die. What exists in the spaces between those two states and has made that liminal territory into a home more permanent than any house built from wood and nails and human hope. If you've made it this far in our journey together through Holloway Archives, you already know the truth that historians and folklorists prefer to avoid. Some places don't fade from memory through the simple passage of time. They fray, coming apart, thread by thread, stitch by stitch, until they resemble something that existed long before maps were drawn or names were given to the features of the landscape. Dogwood Parish was never truly erased from the world. It was unwound, pulled apart with the same careful patience that a seamstress might use to take apart a garment that no longer fit properly, salvaging the thread for use in some new creation that would serve purposes the original maker had never imagined. The Carowway sisters, those keepers of traditions that stretched back to times when the boundary between life and death was negotiated rather than declared, simply continued their work until it was complete. They were never midwives in the way that term is commonly understood. They were memory's hands, fingers trained to hold what the world refused to cradle, voices that whispered to the unborn and the never-born alike, guides who helped navigate the territory that exists between what is and what might have been under different circumstances. They returned what had been forgotten, collected what had been lost, and when their work was finished, they asked for no payment except silence, stillness, and the kind of remembering that happens in lullabies that don't end with sleep, but continue on into dreams that are deeper than dreams, older than sleep itself. Some say they still walk, 3 figures glimpsed at the edge of fields that have been abandoned for decades, passing without casting shadows, their bare feet making no impression on ground that has been softened by rain and time. Others claim that in the brief moments that exist between waking and sleep, in that territory where consciousness has not yet decided what is real and what is imagined, they can hear the soft click of thread being drawn through flesh, the slow creak of an empty cradle, the breathless hush of a room that someone is about to enter but hasn't quite entered yet. Maybe Dogwood Parish never existed at all, except as a story that mothers tell their daughters when they want to explain why some knowledge comes with prices that aren't revealed until long after the transaction has been completed. Maybe it exists still, just a few steps to the left of the world we think we know, accessible to those who understand that some births take longer than 9 months, some deaths take longer than a lifetime, and some stories continue telling themselves long after everyone who might have heard them has stopped listening. But if you ever find a bowl at your door filled with liquid that steams in cool air and remains cool in warm air, if you ever hear your child singing melodies in languages you never taught them, if you ever wake to find threads woven through your hair while you slept, remember the lesson that Dogwood Parish spent years teaching anyone willing to learn. Don't answer right away. Don't speak names that carry more weight than voices were designed to bear. And whatever you do, don't try to name what was never meant to take the shape that names require. Just listen. Just wait. Just remember that some stories are not told for entertainment or education, but as warnings wrapped in wonder, as invitations that are also farewells, as lullabies that are also maps, leading to territories where the usual rules about beginning and ending, about birth and death, about what is possible and what is merely hoped for, do not apply in the ways that daylight logic insists they must. This has been Holloway Archives, and this has been the story of Dogwood Parish, where 3 sisters practiced arts older than medicine, older than prayer, and perhaps older than mercy itself. Some stories end, some stories just pause, waiting for the next person brave enough or foolish enough to pick up the thread and see where it leads. Until next time, when we descend again into the forgotten corners where history blurs into legend, and legend reveals itself to be the only kind of truth that matters when the lights go out, and the familiar world becomes strange enough to show us what it has been hiding in plain sight all along. Thank you for listening. And remember, some doors should never be opened. Some names should never be spoken, and some lullabies should never be sung to completion, because the silence that follows them is not empty, but full, pregnant with possibilities that were never meant to be born into a world that thinks it understands the difference between what is real and what is merely true. The chapel remained untouched through all of this, leaning still into its shadowed slope, its windows dark, and door standing half open, as if awaiting someone expected home long ago. The path to its door was worn smooth despite the fact that no visitors had been seen approaching it for months, and the garden behind it continued to produce vegetables that grew in impossible shapes, twisted into forms that hurt the mind to contemplate. A traveling priest, passing through the area in search of souls to save, stopped at the chapel to offer Mass, only to find the altar gone and the crucifix turned backward, its arms pointing toward the earth rather than the sky. He followed a trail of black feathers to the ridge, feathers that appeared fresh despite the winter cold, and he never returned. His horse wandered into town 3 days later with its mane sheared in a pattern that resembled braided hair, and its eyes weeping assaults that burned the skin of anyone who tried to touch it. That same night, 3 infants were born across the parish, though none of them claimed mothers from the local population. Each was left swaddled at a doorstep, bearing no mark of their origin, save for a small stitch at the base of the neck, threaded with what appeared to be human hair. The townsfolk buried them in the church cemetery, but the ground refused to hold them. Each morning the graves were found empty, the earth disturbed from below rather than above, as if something had called the bodies back to a deeper darkness. In the thaw of early 1845, a new sound began echoing through the ridge at night. It was not the cry of coyotes or the crack of trees breaking under frost, but a low humming that seemed deliberate and layered, almost choral in its complexity. It rose from the direction of the Carowway house just after the second bell of evening and ceased precisely before dawn, as regular as breathing, as predictable as a heartbeat. Those who heard it described feeling as if something were being pulled from them with each note, memories or marrow or breath itself drawn out through their ears and carried away on the wind. One man, overcome with curiosity despite the warnings of his neighbors, approached the ridge with cotton stuffed in his ears and a crucifix nailed to his chest for protection. He was found hours later in his own barn, naked from the waist down, his hands clasped in prayer, and his mouth stuffed full of dried lavender. He lived 3 more days, repeating only one sentence to his grieving wife. It was not song, it was stitching. When he died, every candle in town flickered once, then burned with a blue flame until the wick vanished entirely, leaving only pools of wax that had hardened into shapes no one wished to examine too closely. A new family arrived that spring, unaware of the township's gradual unraveling. The Whitlows were traders from the eastern counties, eager to establish themselves in what they believed was fertile, undervalued land. They took up residence in an abandoned parsonage near the outer fields and immediately set about making themselves known to their new neighbors, reopening the schoolhouse and inviting families for supper on their second week in residence. Their eldest daughter, Miriam, a girl of perhaps 16 with bright eyes and an adventurous spirit, found a parcel wrapped in oilskin beneath her bed one morning. Inside was a braid of white hair tied with milkweed, and a note written in crooked cursive that made her mother's hand shake when she read it. The first breath must not be wasted. Her mother burned the braid in the kitchen stove that night, but instead of flame, the stove burst open with no fire, only smoke, thick and salt-sweet, that spread across the walls in the shape of 3 open hands. The smoke lingered for hours, and when it finally dissipated, it left behind stains that could not be scrubbed away, handprints that seemed to press deeper into the wood with each passing day. The next morning, Miriam was gone.
Her boots were placed neatly on the windowsill, their laces soaked in honey and tied in knots that resembled tiny nooses. When the Whitlows asked around town for help in finding their daughter, the townsfolk simply lowered their eyes and turned away. No one offered assistance. No one spoke the sisters' names. Not anymore. That knowledge had become too dangerous to voice aloud. The townsfolk turned to older habits then, practices their grandmothers had whispered about in times of great need. Doors were marked with lamb's blood, Bibles tucked beneath pillows, mirrors covered with sackcloth from dusk till dawn. Children were no longer taught to pray in the traditional manner, but to count backward from 13, to bite their tongues during thunder, to spit when the wind changed direction. Even so, the Carowway presence thickened like cream left too long in the sun. Footprints appeared in ash that no one had walked through, perfect impressions of bare feet that led from house to house in patterns that suggested visitation rather than wandering. Cradles rocked on their own in empty rooms, and the newborn named Tobias was set to sing in his sleep strange lullabies in a language that no elder could name or place. When his father tried to record the melody on manuscript paper, hoping to understand what his son was channeling, his pen cracked and began bleeding ink in the shape of a cradle. The paper itself began to smoke and curl, and the melody, when written down, seemed to writhe on the page like something alive trying to escape its confines. Tobias was found dead in his crib 2 weeks later, though not from any illness the physician could identify. He had simply vanished from his crib during the night, leaving behind only a mound of river clay, still wet with the impression of a mouth pressed into its center. The midwife who was called to prepare the burial took one look at the clay impression and quit her post that same night. She walked barefoot into the marsh on the far side of the parish and was never seen again, though some claimed to hear her voice calling from deep in the reeds on nights when the moon was dark and the air was still. By midsummer, the birds had stopped singing entirely. Not one crow, not one thrush, not even the hardy sparrows that had always nested in the church eaves. There was only silence, heavy and wide, that seemed to muffle even the sound of human voices. The Carowway sisters, now seen only in pairs, moved like shadows through fields of grain, always walking between the rows, always carrying baskets that hung too still to contain anything living. A farm boy named Caleb, tasked with watching the grain fields for signs of blight or pest, claimed to see Eunice standing waist-deep in the stalks at dusk, her arms outstretched in a posture that might have been crucifixion or might have been invitation. He watched for nearly an hour as crows landed upon her, one by one, perching along her shoulders and arms and head, until she resembled a scarecrow made of flesh and feathers. She never moved, never flinched, as their claws found perches in her skin. When he blinked, they were gone, and so was she. He returned to the farmhouse with his mouth full of black feathers, unable to speak or cry, just sitting there, breathing slowly as feathers slipped one by one from between his lips, like dark prayers made manifest. That same evening, the parish bell fell from its tower without warning. No wind to blame, no earthquake to explain its sudden descent. It struck the earth with a sound like thunder and left a crater shaped uncannily like an open hand.
fingers spread wide as if grasping for something just out of reach. As the year waned toward its close, the Carowway house stood apparently vacant, or so the remaining townspeople believed. No candlelight flickered in its windows, no footprints marked the frost that gathered on its threshold. Yet a warm scent lingered in the air around it, like milk left too long in linen, sweet at first, but growing more complex and disturbing with each breath. Children born that season were unnaturally quiet, never crying, never fussing, just watching the world with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold knowledge no infant should possess. Their mothers kept them wrapped tight in layer upon layer of cloth, refusing to bring them to the chapel for baptism. One mother who attempted the ritual claimed the baptismal water turned to steam the moment it touched her child's forehead. Another said her infant's skin blistered beneath the cross, leaving marks that resembled tiny handprints pressed into the flesh. Stories began to thicken and spread like blood through water. There were tales of twins born under the same moon but breathing out of sync, their heartbeats offset by exactly half a measure. There was a girl who wept blood, but only when the ridge faced east, as if responding to some celestial alignment that governed her sorrow. There were infants who whispered in their sleep, carrying on conversations in voices that belonged to no living person. The Carowway sisters were last seen together on the edge of the cornfields at dusk, standing still as scarecrows, their arms wrapped in swaddling cloth that moved in the breeze despite the absence of wind. Behind them, something shifted in the stalks, something taller than any man and breathing not with lungs but with memory, each exhalation carrying the weight of lives unlived and stories untold. September brought with it a harvest that no one dared to touch. The corn grew in tight, contorted spirals that hurt the eyes to follow, and pumpkins burst open before ripening, revealing not seeds, but veins that pulsed with dark fluid. Even the wheat turned brittle and strange, crackling underfoot like bone when anyone was brave enough to walk through the fields. At the edge of the farthest field, where the soil had never yielded more than stones and stubborn weeds, a new crop emerged without explanation. Tall stalks rose overnight, bearing velvet red tassels that wept a clear, sweet liquid when cut. No one claimed to have planted them, yet every morning brought new growth, spreading in patterns that suggested intention rather than chance. The Carowways were seen walking among these strange stalks in silence, trailing long-handled shears that never seemed to rust despite their constant use. A young woman named Bethany Lawn, curious and unafraid in the way that youth often is, stole one of the stalks under moonlight and brewed a tea from its leaves, thinking it might hold some medicinal property that could benefit her ailing mother. Her mother found her 3 days later in the orchard, seated upright in her wedding gown, her hair perfectly plaited and her hands clasped around a bundle of moss and dried flowers. Her eyes had been stitched shut with thread so fine it was nearly invisible, and her mouth was curved in a smile that seemed carved rather than natural. Every tooth bore a name scratched into the enamel in script so small it required a magnifying glass to read, but none of the names belonged to anyone living in the parish. October's fog did not lift as it should have. It settled low across the parish, thick enough to swallow footsteps and muffle the sound of hammers and hymnals alike. Time began to lose its grip on the community. Clocks ran backward, roosters crowed at dusk, and graves grew cold even in the pale daylight that managed to filter through the perpetual mist.
when Carowway was seen walking the riverbank, barefoot as always, pressing her palm to the water again and again, as if trying to divine something from its surface. No one dared call to her or ask what she sought. Children reported hearing lullabies coming from wells and drains, sweet melodies that seemed to bubble up from deep underground. One girl vanished for half a day and returned dry, but somehow changed. Her fingernails softened as if she had been underwater for years. She no longer recognized her own name, answering only to the small one, and insisted that her birth had not yet occurred, that she was still waiting for the proper moment to draw her first breath. At the town's edge, a midwife's ledger appeared overnight, nailed to the door of the chapel with iron spikes that had gone black with age. Its pages were filled with entries in various hands, recording births that spanned decades, but the final entry bore no date or mother's name, only a location scrawled in what appeared to be soot beneath the ribs. That evening, the chapel windows began to weep sap like tears, and the pews were found turned to face the walls rather than the altar, as if the congregation was expected to pray to something other than God. The altar itself had developed a crack that ran from corner to corner, and when the wind blew through the building, it made a sound like a woman in labor, low and rhythmic and full of effort. As the year waned toward its close, the Carowway house maintained its facade of emptiness, but those who passed near it on the road claimed to hear humming in reverse, like breath being pulled back into a mouth that no longer had need of air. The ridge itself grew quiet, not with peace, but with the kind of pause that precedes something momentous, something that has been long prepared for and is now ready to be born into the world. By the turn of 1846, Dogwood Parish no longer appeared on circuit maps. Postal riders passed it by without pause, their routes adjusted to mark only a blank stretch of ridge where once there had been plotted lines, parcel names, and chapels with recorded pew counts. Surveyors sent from Augusta to update the county records reported soft ground unsuitable for homestead, though none could explain the outline of fence posts still visible in the brush, or the narrow trails that remained pressed into the earth, still warm from recent passage. What few families remained did so quietly, as if not to startle something that had taken up residence in their midst. Gardens were left unplanted that year. Church services ceased without official word, yet smoke still curled from the chimney of the Carowway house, crooked and calm, rising through fog that refused to lift no matter how bright the sun or how strong the wind. 3 windows blinked with light in no rhythm known to human understanding, first 1, then 2, then none, for days at a time. Those who stayed whispered of wooden bowls that appeared overnight, placed at their doors, beneath eaves, on fence posts, always filled with a slick black liquid that smelled faintly of breast milk and rust. The bowls were never seen being delivered, but they came without fail, as regular as sunrise, as inevitable as death. Some families poured the contents out without question, and nothing untoward happened to them. Others kept the bowls, unsure why, allowing the liquid to congeal or steam depending on the temperature of the room. But one man, Jacob Fincher, a carpenter with no wife and no kin to counsel him against foolish acts, tossed his untouched bowl into the hearth on a dare from his own troubled conscience. The fire hissed and shuddered, but did not consume the liquid. Instead, it spread across the burning logs like oil, turning the flames blue-white and filling the room with smoke that smelled of lilies and copper. That night, he heard footsteps on his roof, slow and deliberate, heavier than any animal, but with a cadence that suggested something expectant, like a woman late in her 9th month pacing through the final hours before birth. He did not sleep, and by morning, his roof was ruined. Every shingle had been turned inward and folded like paper, each nail bent skyward as though pulled from within by invisible fingers. In the center of his parlor sat a cradle made of ash wood and human hair, woven together with such skill that it seemed to have grown rather than been constructed. Inside it lay nothing except a single hair, pink at the root, dark at the tip, coiled like a question mark against the white lining. Fincher fled by nightfall, his wagon packed with every tool he owned, his horses lathered with sweat and terror. He was never seen again in those parts. But the cradle remained in his abandoned house for weeks, unmoved and apparently unmovable. When a field mouse was found dead inside it, the creature's skin intact but deflated, as if its breath had been stolen rather than its body harmed, the remaining townspeople finally summoned the courage to try burning the thing. The cradle refused to catch fire. Even pitch and lamp oil could find no grip on the strange wood. It had to be buried, but even then the ground rejected it, spitting it back to the surface the next morning, upright and cleaner than before, waiting on the church steps where it had no earthly business being. A traveling priest, sent from a neighboring parish to investigate the reports of strange happenings, came to Dogwood with the full authority of the church behind him. He dismissed the local stories as superstition, born of isolation and too much communion with strong spirits. But he was gone within a week, claiming sudden illness that required immediate attention in Charleston. Later, a telegram was received at the parish post office, a single line with no signature. They do not offer gifts, they deliver warnings. After that, no bowls appeared again, but the Carowway windows kept their irregular glowing, and the wind began to carry the sound of someone rocking in a chair that no one could see. A steady creak and sigh that seemed to come from every direction at once. The wind changed direction in March, but not the way it does before a storm. It circled instead, low and close to the earth, curling up beneath skirts, slipping through keyholes, stirring candle wicks that had not yet been lit. The townspeople spoke less and less, even the boldest among them no longer willing to cross into the eastern woods, where the ridge began its steep climb toward the Carowway house. Yet the sisters were seen more frequently now, always at a distance, always in motion. They passed through rows of bearing crops, across porches long abandoned, along creek beds that had dried into veins of white stone. Once, they were seen kneeling around a tree stump near Widow Ames' barn, their heads bowed not in prayer, but in perfect stillness, their hands placed flat on the frozen earth as though listening for a heartbeat buried deep below the frost line. Then came the birth that broke whatever silence had been holding the darkness at bay. Marian Doyle had not spoken since the death of her husband the year before, dedicating herself to sewing by candlelight and humming tunes her mother had once whispered during the hardest winters, songs that held no language, only vowel sounds and breath shaped into something that might have been comfort. She was not known to be with child. No one had seen a swell beneath her apron. No one had observed the telltale signs that usually preceded such an event. Yet one night, neighbors reported screams from her cabin, long and low and layered with something else. Not agony, not the familiar sounds of labor, but something closer to warning, as if she were trying to alert the world to something it was not prepared to understand. At dawn, her chimney stood cold, her door slightly ajar, and a pair of swaddling cloths hung from the window latch like flags of surrender. One damp with birth water, the other dry and stained with something darker. Inside, Marian was seated upright on her bed, rocking gently, her eyes fixed on a wooden bowl at her feet. The bowl was empty, was stained at the rim with something that might have been blood, if blood could hold such darkness. Across her lap lay a child wrapped in moss and pinned closed with black thorns rather than cloth pins. The baby breathed, but only once every few minutes, its tiny chest rising and falling with such deliberate timing that those who witnessed it feel compelled to hold their own breath in sympathy. The doctor, summoned from the next county, could not explain it, and the preacher would not approach close enough to offer blessing or last rites. When asked for the child's name, Marian whispered one syllable in a tone that cracked her lips and left them bleeding, a sound that might have been a name or might have been something else entirely, something that human throats were not designed to produce. Later that same day, a neighbor found a trail of twine and dried lavender buds leading from Marian's cabin to the Carowway Ridge, twisted in patterns and knots that mirrored the shapes of cradles, teeth, and swollen bellies. An old widow, the last person in the parish who remembered the protection stitches used by midwives in darker centuries, recognized the design immediately. It was not meant to preserve the child, she explained to anyone brave enough to listen, but to ward against its memory, to prevent whatever had been born from taking root in the collective consciousness of the living. That night, a mirror shattered in a schoolhouse without sound or cause, and 3 birds were found beneath the window, their wings folded backward and their eyes reflecting light that came from no earthly source. Marian's cabin burned from within that same evening, though the exterior remained untouched by flame. In the ash, only the bowl remained, now filled again with that black, curdled milk, and beside it a single message burned into the floorboards with heatless flame: do not name what should not have formed. Afterward, those who passed near the Carowway home claimed to hear humming in reverse, like breath being pulled back into a mouth that no longer belonged to the living. The ridge grew quiet again, but not with peace. It was the quiet of something waiting, something that had come through from wherever such things originate and was now patient for the proper moment to make its presence fully known. By the first thaw of April, the earth beneath Dogwood Parish had begun to shift, not dramatically, not with quakes or visible clacks, but subtly, as though something deep within had started breathing with its own rhythm. Fence posts leaned without cause, stones sank into soil that had once been dry and firm as brick, and graves tilted forward in the western field as if their occupants were trying to sit up and take notice of what was happening above ground. A scarecrow in the Hutchins field turned overnight, its arms now angled downward with palms open to the ground, its head bowed in what might have been reverence or might have been shame. No one claimed to have moved it, and when the children asked why it had changed, the elders answered only, because something else is watching now. That night, no lamps were lit in any house throughout the parish, as if by some unspoken agreement that light might draw unwanted attention. The Carowway sisters had not been seen in over a week, yet signs of their presence appeared each morning like gifts from an unseen benefactor. A child's shoe, hand-stitched and unworn, was found in the rafters of the blacksmith's shed. A string of garlic, braided with human hair, appeared nailed above the preacher's door. Porridge was discovered in an empty crib, still warm, though no fire had been lit in that house for months. Then, at the town square, a stone appeared overnight. It was flat and gray, polished smooth as a river rock, but large enough to serve as a table. It bore no name or inscription, just a groove carved into its center, wide enough and deep enough for a newborn to lie in, with room to spare. The townspeople did not touch it, crossing themselves when they passed and hurrying their children along with sharp words and sharper glances. On the second day, a woman was found curled inside the groove, her body fitting the depression as if it had been carved specifically for her frame. She had no memory of how she had arrived there, no shoes on her feet, and no mark on her body, save for a single word carved shallow into her shoulder blade. Mine. The letters were precise, deliberate, cut with something sharper than any blade the local physician had ever seen. When the doctor attempted to examine the wound more closely to determine what instrument might have made such clean cuts, the skin refused to part further. His scalpel, made of the finest steel, bent against her flesh as if it were iron striking diamond. He burned the instrument afterward, claiming it had been contaminated by something he could not name, but would not risk carrying into his other work. The woman was taken in by the apothecary's wife, a kind soul who had never been blessed with children of her own.
But the arrangement proved troubling from the first night. The woman did not sleep, did not blink, and would not eat unless spoken to first in rhyme, as if some part of her mind required poetry to unlock the most basic functions of survival. Soon after this discovery, the chapel bell rang again, once and sharply, at the hour of deepest night when even the most restless souls should have been at peace. Beside the chapel's threshold, the cradle returned, though no one saw who placed it there. It stood wrapped in wool and salt, filled not with a living child, but with a small wax figure that bore a disturbing resemblance to human craftsmanship. The figure's eyes were closed, its lips stitched shut with thread so fine it seemed to have grown from the wax itself. A thread extended from the figure's mouth like an umbilical cord, leading back toward the ridge in a perfect straight line that never wavered or caught on the obstacles in its path. No one dared follow it, but the preacher's youngest daughter, Eleonora, began walking in her sleep that very week, always in the same direction, always toward the ridge where the thread disappeared into the darkness. Her parents tied her wrists to the bedposts and prayed louder than they ever had before, but still every night she woke with mud under her fingernails and hair damp with dew that smelled of milk and something sweeter, something that reminded those who caught the scent of their own first breath. When asked what she dreamed of during these nocturnal journeys, she answered with a certainty that chilled her parents. "The sisters are sewing me." By month's end, Eleonora was gone.
Her bed remained undisturbed, her shoes dry and placed neatly beside the door, but only her baptismal dress remained, folded with ceremonial precision on the pew where she had once sung psalms in a voice clear as spring water. The buttons of the dress had been replaced with tiny polished teeth, each one carved with initials that belonged to no living child in the parish. The preacher collapsed that morning upon discovering the dress, whispering scripture that didn't belong to any known testament. He claimed it had been taught to him in a dream by a hand that had no fingers, only soft twine wrapped in milkweed, writing verses in the air that burned themselves into his memory without the need for sight or sound. The ground around the Carowway house began to bulge slightly now, as though something inside had started to grow roots that spread beneath the foundation, seeking purchase in soil that had been prepared for them across decades of careful tending. Each night, as the wind curled low through the fields, it carried the sound of something being cradled, not crying, not cooing, but remembering its way back into existence through sheer force of will. The final summer before Dogwood Parish vanished from all living memory began with the birth that no one could claim. At the edge of Gallows Fen, where cattails grow too tall and the air tastes of iron and old pennies, a fisherman found a child wrapped in linen, floating just above the waterline, dry and untouched by the murky water that should have claimed it immediately. The child hummed softly to itself, a melody that seemed older than any lullaby the fisherman had ever heard, older, perhaps, than the human voice itself. There was no umbilical cord, no sign of struggle or trauma, just a note stitched into the cloth wrapping with thread the color of dried blood. Returned. The fisherman brought the child to the chapel out of habit, though no preacher had remained in Dogwood for weeks. The bell tower had caved inward, the altar had split down its center like a broken heart, and the stained glass windows had melted, their leaded bones creating patterns on the floor that hurt to look at directly. He left the infant on the last unbroken pew and walked out without looking back, some instinct warning him that lingering would be unwise. That night, his fishing boat was found splintered along the riverbank, its boards arranged in the unmistakable shape of a woman's open arms, as if the vessel had been carefully dismantled and rebuilt into a gesture of embrace, or perhaps surrender. His body was never found, though search parties combed the river for miles in both directions. The child, however, remained exactly where he had left it, patient and watchful. It was taken in by an old widow who had outlived all 4 of her sons and had stopped speaking after the last was swallowed by a threshing machine accident that no one could adequately explain. She never asked where the girl had come from, never attempted to give her a name, only fed her thin broth and placed an old rosary in her crib, not for protection, but for recognition, as if the beads might help her remember something she had once known. The girl never blinked, never cried, and most disturbing of all, never aged. She sat each night facing the window that overlooked the ridge, her mouth slightly open as though waiting for something to be placed inside, some morsel of knowledge or sustenance that only the darkness could provide. One morning, the widow woke to find her own wedding veil spread across the floor, soaked in milk that had somehow remained warm despite sitting in the cool morning air for hours. The child was gone, and in her place was a bundle of stitched linens filled with water that maintained the exact temperature of a human womb. Nestled within the water was a single vertebra, polished to a shine and carved with the letter M in script so elegant it seemed to have been written by someone with far more education than anyone in Dogwood Parish possessed. That same week, a young boy, the son of the coopers who ran the general store, began speaking in tongues during his sleep. But these were not the glossolalia of religious ecstasy. He spoke names that hadn't been uttered since the township's founding: Other, Razand, Bethel, all stillborns, all buried behind the chapel before the war, when the community was young and full of hope for the future that was now unraveling before their eyes. His mother, panicked by the implications of her son's midnight recitations, burned every cradle in the house and buried the ashes in a ground that had been blessed by 3 different ministers. But the boy's nocturnal speeches continued, growing more fluid each night, as if he were learning a language that existed somewhere between life and death. He began drawing with his food, making perfect diagrams with mashed vegetables and milk, creating images that no child should have known how to render. Birth canals in cross-section, skull formations from medical textbooks, midwife sigils from eastern provinces that none of the adults had ever visited or even heard described. When the apothecary, the most educated man remaining in the parish, asked him where he had learned such things, the boy smiled with knowledge far beyond his years and answered, "They left it in my marrow." He died 2 days later with no apparent cause, simply stopped breathing, as if someone had reached inside his small chest and gently turned off whatever mechanism kept his lungs working. When the physician examined his bones during the preparation for burial, he discovered they had softened and folded slightly, as if they were waiting to be rewoven into some new configuration that served purposes beyond mere structural support. By midsummer, 3 more infants had been found in various locations around the parish. None had been born in any conventional sense, yet all were placed with the care of someone who understood the proper protocols for such deliveries. Each was swaddled in white cloth. Each bore a mark at the base of the spine, a row of 6 tiny dots arranged in a perfect arc, as if punctured by a curved needle following some ancient pattern known only to practitioners of arts that predated modern medicine. The 3rd infant opened its eyes only once, and witnesses swore its pupils were vertical, like those of a serpent or some other creature that had adapted to see in conditions where human sight would fail. It did not blink, did not breathe in any rhythm that observers could detect, but the midwife who touched its chest felt a second heartbeat beneath her own, as if the child were somehow sharing her circulatory system across the barrier of skin and bone. She never delivered another child after that encounter, claiming her hands had been contaminated by something that made them unsuitable for the work of bringing life into the world. She moved to a cabin on the far edge of the parish and spent her remaining days weaving cloth that served no purpose anyone could determine, patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The sewing began again in late July, but now it appeared in places where no thread belonged and no human hand could have placed it. Fine fibers were found woven into fence lines, braided through the manes of horses that had been pastured far from any dwelling, curled inside ears of corn that had not yet been harvested. The thread was pale, almost translucent, and sticky to the touch, as if it had been drawn from something not yet fully cooled from whatever process had created it. It carried a smell that no one could name, sweet but not like sugar, thick but not like rot. It was the smell of potential, of something waiting to become what it was always meant to be. Those who tried to burn the thread discovered it would not ignite in any conventional sense. Instead, it curled and released a sound like breath caught in a throat, a whisper of air that seemed to carry words in languages that had been forgotten before the first Europeans set foot on American soil. No one spoke of the Carowway sisters by name anymore, not because they had vanished, but because the townspeople had learned that speaking their names was not summoning or invocation. It was offering, an invitation extended to forces that had been waiting patiently for such recognition. And once acknowledged, they were under no obligation to limit their presence to the hours and circumstances that might be convenient for mortal sensibilities. It was the Cooper's youngest daughter, Ruthie, who found the cloth bundle folded with mathematical precision on the threshold of the abandoned schoolhouse. The fabric was stained in a deep umber hue that seemed to shift between brown and red depending on the angle of observation, and across its front were 3 symbols stitched in thick, deliberate strokes that suggested both great care and practiced familiarity with the art of needle and thread. No one in the parish knew the language or could interpret the symbols, but every old woman who looked at the cloth flinched as if struck, some ancestral memory recognizing patterns that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that certain knowledge came with prices that were not always immediately apparent. Ruthie brought the bundle home, thinking it might serve as a doll's quilt for the cornhusk figures she enjoyed crafting during the long afternoons when chores were finished and evening had not yet called her indoors. She wrapped it around a bundle of hay and sang lullabies to it until dusk, innocent melodies her mother had taught her, songs that spoke of sleep and safety and the comfort of being held by someone who loved you unconditionally. At midnight, she woke her mother without making any sound, simply standing at the foot of the bed with her small hands wrapped around her own throat. Her palms were raw from squeezing. Her lips bore needle pricks arranged in a pattern that resembled stitching. And on her tongue, barely visible in the lamplight, was a single thread of that pale, sticky fiber, pulled tight enough to indent the flesh, but not quite tight enough to prevent speech entirely. The cloth bundle was burned, or so her father claimed, though the flames that consumed it burned blue and gave off no heat, and the ashes that remained formed shapes that were better left unexamined. Ruthie was never quite the same after that night. She stopped speaking altogether, stopped blinking with any normal frequency, and slept with her eyes open, never facing the window that looked toward the ridge. When the doctor examined her, hoping to understand what had caused such dramatic changes in a previously healthy child, he found that her tongue had disappeared entirely. Not cut, not injured in any way that would suggest violence or accident. Simply gone, as if it had been swallowed back into some unseen root system that extended far deeper than anatomy textbooks suggested was possible. In place of speech, her throat hummed softly, like a lullaby buried under soil that had been packed too tightly to allow sound to escape naturally. The melody was constant, barely audible, but those who spent time in her presence found themselves unconsciously synchronizing their breathing to its rhythm, as if her humming was teaching their bodies to remember patterns of inhalation and exhalation that predated conscious thought. That same week, the birds returned to Dogwood Parish, but they no longer sang. Instead, they perched on rooftops and chimney tops in absolute silence, their heads tilted at angles that allowed them to watch windows, cribs, and mothers who walked with their hands folded tightly over their wombs, as if protecting something precious from influences that might seek to claim it before its final transformation. Then came the sound that would haunt the dreams of anyone fortunate enough to leave Dogwood before its final transformation. It started low, almost imperceptible, like wood rocking against wood, in a rhythm that suggested comfort and care. But it grew louder each night until the entire town seemed to creak and sway, as if the buildings themselves had been transformed into massive cradles being rocked by hands too large to be seen. People initially thought the sound came from old trees shifting in the wind, until they noticed it occurred only when the air was perfectly still. One woman, braver or more curious than the rest, finally followed the sound through fog thick enough to muffle footsteps and obscure vision beyond a few yards. She walked barefoot to avoid making noise that might disturb whatever was creating the rhythmic creaking. She stopped at the base of the Carowway Ridge, where 100 cradles stood in perfect lines across the grass, each one empty, each one swaying gently in place, though no wind stirred the air around them. The cradles were crafted from different woods, decorated with different patterns, sized for infants of various ages, but all moved with the same measured rhythm, as if operated by a single mechanism that existed somewhere beyond the visible world. In the center of this impossible nursery stood the three sisters. Hester at the front, her eyes closed and her face serene, with the expression of someone listening to music too beautiful for others to hear. Eunice beside her, one hand raised as if conducting an orchestra of invisible musicians. Maribeth behind them both, her hands outstretched, holding thread between her fingers, not sewing, but listening, as if the fibers were whispering secrets that only she had been trained to understand. The woman who witnessed this scene turned and fled, but by morning her hands had been stitched together at the wrists with that same translucent fiber, and across her chest, beneath her blouse where no one else could see, were 6 tiny dots arranged in that familiar curved pattern. She never spoke again, only hummed in harmony with young Ruthie Cooper, their combined voices creating melodies that seemed to reach frequencies human ears were not designed to detect. By August's end, what little remained of Dogwood Parish had ceased to resemble a town in any conventional sense. The wells ran clear, but tasted faintly of ash and something metallic that coated the tongue and lingered long after the water had been swallowed. Crops stood upright in the fields, but bore no yield. Only hollow gourds and boneless stalks, apples that collapsed under their own weight when touched, releasing not juice, but a fine dust that sparkled briefly in the sunlight before being carried away on breezes that seemed to come from no earthly source. The animals had grown silent in ways that suggested they were responding to communications occurring on frequencies beyond human perception. Chickens laid eggs shaped more like teardrops than the oval forms that had nourished families for generations. Each egg, when cracked, revealed not yolk, but a thick, pulpy silk that moved slightly when exposed to air, as if it retained some memory of life even after being separated from whatever had created it. One farmer, desperate for food to feed his remaining livestock, cracked open what appeared to be the most normal of these strange eggs. Inside, nestled in the silk like a pearl in an oyster, he found a perfect miniature jawbone, still soft and wet as if it had been recently formed. He left town the next day, dragging his daughter behind him in a wagon padded with salt blocks and hymnals, repeating a single phrase that became his constant mantra: "The births are not births, they're returns." A traveling parson named Ulrich arrived under cover of fog, carrying a dog-eared Bible and a tin crucifix that had been warped by heat into shapes that suggested it had been exposed to fires that burned hotter than any earthly flame. He had heard rumors in the outer counties, whispers of stillborns that breathed again, of midwives with fingers too long to fit inside conventional gloves, of lullabies sung by children who hadn't been born yet, but somehow remembered melodies from times and places that existed outside the normal flow of history. He entered Dogwood with a sermon on his lips, full of judgment and thunder, prepared to drive out whatever darkness had taken root in this forgotten corner of God's creation. But no one greeted him, not because they failed to see him, but because they saw what followed behind him as he walked. 3 shadows moving without gait, never touching the ground, their forms suggesting the outline of women, but lacking the substance that would make them recognizably human.
The parson slept in the chapel that first night, though the building had no roof and smelled of milk that had been left too long in vessels that had never been properly cleaned. He awoke just before dawn to the sound of water dripping slowly onto stone, each drop falling with the measured precision of a metronome, marking time from musicians who played songs that living ears were not meant to hear. He followed the sound to what remained of the altar, where he found a wax infant seated in the pulpit, its hollow eyes reflecting light that came from no visible source. From its chest leaked a clear fluid that steamed when it struck the stone, leaving stains that resembled handprints pressed into the surface by fingers that had never learned the proper boundaries between flesh and spirit. Ulrich placed the trembling hand to the figure's brow and wept, not from pity, but from recognition, as if he were encountering something he had always known existed, but had hoped never to meet face to face. He left the chapel carrying nothing, walked barefoot to the Carowway house, humming a tune older than the Psalms, and stood at the crooked gate until one of the sisters opened the door. Which sister it was, no one could say with certainty. Their faces had begun to shift in memory, becoming too similar, too blurred by time and something else that made it difficult for human minds to retain clear impressions of their features. The parson slept in the chapel that first night, though the building had no roof and smelled of milk that had been left too long in vessels that had never been properly cleaned. He awoke just before dawn to the sound of water dripping slowly onto stone, each drop falling with the measured precision of a metronome, marking time from musicians who played songs that living ears were not meant to hear.
He followed the sound to what remained of the altar, where he found a wax infant seated in the pulpit, its hollow eyes reflecting light that came from no visible source. From its chest leaked a clear fluid that steamed when it struck the stone, leaving stains that resembled handprints pressed into the surface by fingers that had never learned the proper boundaries between flesh and spirit. Ulrich placed the trembling hand to the figure's brow and wept, not from pity, but from recognition, as if he were encountering something he had always known existed, but had hoped never to meet face to face. He left the chapel carrying nothing, walked barefoot to the Carowway house, humming a tune older than the Psalms, and stood at the crooked gate until one of the sisters opened the door. Which sister it was, no one could say with certainty. Their faces had begun to shift in memory, becoming too similar, too blurred by time and something else that made it difficult for human minds to retain clear impressions of their features. He stepped inside, the door closed behind him, and no light showed through the windows that night, though the entire town slept without sound. No cries, no restless breathing, just silence that was long and warm and suggested the kind of peace that comes only when struggle has finally ended. In the morning, the chapel pews were found stacked in groups of 3, each pile tied with what appeared to be umbilical cord that had been dried and preserved with techniques that belonged to traditions much older than Christianity. The altar had split again, this time revealing a hollow beneath, shaped like a womb and lined with soot and tiny claw marks that suggested something had been scratching at the interior surface, trying to enlarge the space to accommodate whatever was meant to emerge from it. Ulrich's Bible was placed inside this hollow, its pages sewn shut with thread that gleamed gold in the lamplight. No one read it, no one dared to touch it, and soon after its placement, the fog thickened beyond anything natural, and time began to fold in on itself like fabric being gathered by hands that understood patterns invisible to mortal perception. People began forgetting names, first their neighbors, then their children, then their own. But they all remembered the sisters with perfect clarity. They remembered the cradles that waited, even when no children came to fill them. They remembered the bowls and the thread and the silence that existed between one breath and the next. And in the moments before sleep, if sleep still came to them, they remembered the feeling of someone brushing hair from their foreheads with infinite gentleness, and the sound of lullabies with no words, sung by mouths that had never drawn breath in any conventional sense, but somehow knew all the melodies that mothers had hummed to their children since the beginning of human memory. By the first frost of 1847, no smoke rose from the chimneys of Dogwood Parish. No mail arrived, no bells rang except for the phantom tolling that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than from any tower visible to human eyes. The town, once mapped in careful detail by clerks and circuit riders who took pride in their accuracy, now existed only in the dreams of those who had passed through during its final months. These dreams were populated with half-formed memories of sisters walking barefoot across fields where nothing had grown in years, of lullabies that lodged in the back of the throat like swallowed needles, of the sensation of being watched by eyes that saw not what was, but what had been, and what might yet come to pass under the right circumstances. The Carowway house still stood, leaning more heavily now, as though it bore the weight of something unseen that had taken up residence in its upper rooms. The shutters never opened, the curtains never moved, yet those few travelers brave enough to pass along the ridge road claimed to see silhouettes in the windows. Tall figures swaying gently as if cradling something too small and too precious to be glimpsed by casual observers. The last official record of any visitor to Dogwood Parish came from a tax clerk sent from Westboro, a young man named Elias Pinn, who had never married and who carried with him the confidence of someone who believed that ledgers and legal documents could solve any problem that might present itself in the course of his duties. He arrived at the edge of the parish under pale skies, whistling a hymn without knowing why the melody had come to him, carrying in his leather satchel ink, paper, and a writ for the seizure of the Carowway property, its title having never been formally filed at the county registry. He stayed the night at an empty cabin, ate beans from a tin can, and took his boots off at the door like a man expecting to be made welcome by hosts who were merely temporarily absent. He was never seen again, though weeks later a woman gathering kindling on the ridge found his boots placed side by side on the chapel steps, their leather tied with thread the color of milk that had been left in sunlight too long. Inside each boot was a single vertebra, polished to a gleam and still warm to the touch, as if it had recently been separated from whatever spine had once given it purpose. His satchel was nailed to the chapel door, all its pages removed except one, pinned in place with a hairpin that had been twisted into the shape of a cradle. The remaining page bore only 4 words in script that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Property transferred, child unclaimed. The church doors would not open after that discovery, no matter how much force was applied to the handles or hinges. Families began boarding up their windows from the inside, seeing to their attics, pouring lines of salt across thresholds that hadn't been crossed in weeks. This was not to keep something out, they understood now, but to keep something in, to contain whatever had been growing in their midst until it was ready to reveal itself fully. Infants were still being born, but always too early, or not at all. One woman labored for 16 hours, only to deliver a bundle of roots and cloth stitched together like a practice doll, the kind that young girls used to learn the skills they would need when their own time for motherhood arrived. She named it anyway, speaking to it in the gentle tones she had prepared for a living child. And when she died 3 nights later, with her eyes open and her womb apparently intact, the doll remained warm for 2 days afterward. No decay, no unpleasant scent, just the steady warmth of something that continued to exist in defiance of all natural law. It became clear to those few residents who remained capable of coherent thought that the Carowway sisters were no longer midwives, if indeed they ever had been in any conventional sense of the term. They were keepers now, guardians of what had slipped through the cracks between life and death, stewards of what refused to forget the bodies that had once carried them. They no longer visited homes or hummed beneath windows to comfort women in labor. Instead, their presence was marked by stillness, by the absence of wind and birds, and the sudden, unmistakable sensation that someone, somewhere, had just wrapped the entire world in swaddling cloth and was waiting patiently for it to fall asleep. The frost that year
thickened with unnatural persistence, clinging to surfaces that should not have retained moisture, crawling up window panes from the inside rather than forming on the exterior as physics would suggest. Those who remained in Dogwood Parish no longer marked time by sunrise or moon phases, but by the sound of settling floorboards, the creak of chairs shifting under invisible weight, the whisper of bedsheets folding themselves at the corners as if shaped by hands that had learned their domestic skills in places where such activities served purposes beyond mere comfort. The Carowway Ridge, once studiously avoided by all but the most desperate or foolhardy, became something worse than feared. It became familiar. So familiar that even newcomers who passed through the valley found themselves pausing at its slope, drawn not by conscious decision, but by recognition that seemed to exist at a level deeper than memory. One traveling merchant swore he had seen that crooked house in dreams that had plagued him since childhood, though he had never set foot in Georgia, and his family claimed they descended from Pennsylvania Quakers who would have had no truck with such dark practices. When asked what he saw when he looked at the ridge, the man answered through tears he could not explain. "The room I was born in, the one no one remembers." His body was found the next morning lying across a patch of furrowed dirt, his arms outstretched, his jaw unhinged as if he had been trying to speak words too large for any human mouth to contain.
A nearby oak tree bore the impression of a swaddled child pressed into its bark, deep and clean and deliberate. And it wept sap for 7 days thereafter. Sap that hardened into shapes that resembled tiny hands reaching out from within the wood. The children left in Dogwood began drawing circles again, not just on paper, but scratched into the surfaces of their desks, carved into their blankets, traced into their own forearms with fingernails that had somehow grown sharp enough to break skin. The circles always contained 3 points, one high and 2 low, forming the inverted shape of a cradle, and they appeared with such frequency and consistency that it seemed the children were following instructions provided by a teacher no adult could see or hear. The abandoned schoolhouse bore these markings along every wall, painted in mixtures of flour and ash, spiraled tight like the contractions of labor, each one slightly different from the others, but all unmistakably part of the same vast pattern that suggested organization and purpose beyond anything the human mind could fully comprehend. A boy of 9, whose mother claimed he hadn't spoken since the first serious frost, walked into the chapel ruins and placed a bundle wrapped in clean linen upon what remained of the pulpit. It was not a doll, and it was not breathing in any conventional sense, but the linen pulsed slightly, as if whatever lay within was remembering the rhythm of a heartbeat that had once sustained it. He spoke only one sentence that day, his voice clear and certain despite months of silence. "Not all births come from blood." That evening, threads appeared again, twined through door hinges, woven into the manes of horses that had died weeks earlier, but whose bodies had been left untouched by scavengers, laced through braids of corn that hung drying in attics no longer entered by living feet. The threads stretched in impossible lines, disappearing into the tree line, into chimney flues, into the seams of dresses that had been packed away in trunks when their owners departed for destinations unknown. At dusk, when the sky faded to the color of old bone
Every mirror in town cracked simultaneously, creating spider webs of reflection that showed not the faces of those who looked into them, but other faces, younger faces. Faces that belonged to children who had never been given the chance to grow old enough to look into mirrors and see themselves clearly. What the remaining people of Dogwood feared most was not the possibility that the sisters might return in some dramatic fashion, but the growing realization that they had never left at all. What moved through the ridge and through the veins of every remaining house had not been born of wickedness or supernatural intervention, but of memory itself. A memory so old and so deeply rooted that it had grown its own nervous system, its own names, its own lullabies that were passed down not through teaching, but through dreams.
The Carowway sisters, still standing in that crooked house with lamps that never needed oil or flame, had simply waited long enough for the town to remember that it had always belonged to them. That every birth and every death that had occurred within the boundaries of the parish had been part of a larger pattern they had been weaving since before the first European settlers had cleared the land and built their hopeful homes. The last snowfall came early, blanketing Dogwood Parish before the final harvest could rot naturally in the fields. It arrived without sound, heavy and wet, muting what remained of the community with such finality that even the most faithful among the survivors stopped speaking aloud. No sermons, no blessings, no conversation above a whisper, as if raising one's voice might disturb something that required absolute quiet to complete whatever work it had been doing in the spaces between heartbeats. The snow did not melt, as winter snow should. Instead, it clung to every surface, to windows and roofs, to fences and trees, until the entire ridge looked swaddled, tucked in like an infant's cradle, just before the lullaby that would carry it into sleep deeper than any dreams. No footprints marked this snow. No animals moved through it, and it lay untouched, as if the ground itself had been put to bed by hands that understood the proper techniques for ensuring that rest, once granted, would be permanent. From beneath this blanket of white, the humming returned. But it was no longer the soft lullabies of labor or the gentle rhythms that had once eased mothers through the difficult passages of bringing new life into the world. This sound was slower, deeper, like wet cloth being pulled through wood, a noise that suggested both comfort and constraint. The kind of sound that might emerge from a throat that had learned to make music from the materials of the body itself. It came from every direction at once, from beneath floorboards, from behind walls, from inside basins that had been dry for months, and it carried with it a heat that was not the heat of fire, but the warmth of breath held too long in closed spaces. The kind of temperature that bodies generate when they are wrapped too tightly and for too long in cloth that was meant to comfort, but that begins, over time, to constrict.
Children began sleepwalking in pairs, found each morning holding hands at the center of town, their eyes wide open, their heads tilted at identical angles, as if they were all listening to the same story being told by a voice that only they could hear. They spoke no words during these episodes, but when the doctor placed his ear to the chest of one of them, hoping to determine if illness might be causing these strange behaviors, he recoiled immediately. "It's not her heartbeat," he whispered, shaking so violently that he had to grip a fence post to remain upright. "It's not hers at all." In the chapel ruins, the final sign appeared like a revelation that no one had asked to receive. A cradle stood where the altar had once been, but this cradle had not been carved or crafted by human hands. The wood appeared to have grown into this shape, curling inward like ribs, smoothed by winds that had never touched any earthly surface. Inside the cradle lay a bundle of linens, marked with a single piece of stitching, 3 loops braided into a spiral, identical to the old midwife seal that had once been burned into the Carowway door before anyone could remember when or why such marking had been necessary. Those who saw this final cradle agreed on only one detail. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat measured in deep water, like the rhythm of something that had learned to count time not in seconds or minutes, but in the spaces between one breath and the next, in the pause that exists between the end of one life and the beginning of another. No one touched it. No one prayed over it, and the next day the wind stopped entirely. The Carowway house